fun to sit in a 2-hour, 15-minute lecture where the instructor talks the entire time. So part of the reason I always try to have little discussion activities and stuff, because just listening to me lecture the whole time can be a lot. And it's a lot for me too. I don't love standing up here and talking for 2 hours. But since we got to catch up, that's kind of what we're going to have to do today. Keep in mind, I'm recording everything. I would highly recommend that you, even if you don't normally go back and watch the recordings, that maybe for this one you go back and watch like the second half, because I guarantee you your brain's not going to be absorbing information as great during like the second half of this class as the first half. So it's always a good idea to kind of go back and reabsorb that. So hopefully it doesn't take me the full 2 hours and 15 minutes. I was kind of saying some of this might be shorter because we're sort of just continuing what we were seeing towards the end of young adulthood. So some of the main things we're going to see is that people in middle adulthood tend to experience further declines in both their physical and their cognitive health, something probably all of you are aware of. You might have parents that are kind of falling into this middle-age category, so you might be seeing that on a daily basis in your interactions with them. However, it's not all decline, and it also kind of depends on how we measure things as well, how drastic that decline actually is. So I'll go into some more detail about that. We'll talk about some areas where you actually see improvements in cognition, because despite the fact that maybe our brains are kind of starting to go downhill a little bit, we also have a lot more experience at this point in time that gives us a lot of improvements in the way that we can kind of think and reason through things. Career options during this time tend to start to become a little bit more narrow and limited. So like in young adulthood and college, you kind of have, like all these opportunities in front of you that you could possibly pursue, lots of different paths you could go down. By the time you get to this middle adulthood, that starts to narrow a little bit. And again, just to kind of reference you, time frame we're talking about here is from like 40 to 65 is middle adulthood. So that's kind of the period of ages. So first of all, just some key terms to be aware of. There are several different types of aging that are contributing to both the physical and cognitive declines that we're going to be talking about. Primary aging, that's the same as senescence, which we talked about maybe a couple weeks ago. That's just like natural aging that happens due to, all the things we discussed, like your telomeres shortening, cross-linkage of your tissues. That's the stuff that's pretty much inevitable. You can maybe delay it a little bit through diet and exercise and all that good stuff, but it's pretty much guaranteed that primary aging is going to happen. In addition to that, you have secondary aging, which is usually caused by illness or disease or disability. So someone who maybe, develops cancer, for example, or like a neurodegenerative disorder like Alzheimer's or dementia, they will be suffering from the primary aging, but then they will also have secondary aging on top of that from that disease or illness that will, usually make the aging process happen faster than it normally would. And then tertiary aging, we're not going to talk about much yet, because that's essentially kind of this rapid decline that happens in the weeks leading up to death. So oftentimes people, it kind of depends on the way they die, obviously, but if they die of natural causes, then we often see that in the last few weeks you have this very rapid decline in both their physical and cognitive health. So we'll talk a little bit more about tertiary aging when we get to the very fun topic of death and grieving. Yeah.
You said secondary aging was like having an illness on top of it?
Correct, yeah. Okay. So I'd say a lot of the goal of young adulthood and middle adulthood when it comes to, physical things is trying to avoid getting a disease or illness so that you don't have as much secondary aging, and trying to kind of put off the effects of primary aging as much as possible. That's assuming you want to live a long, healthy life, which I would guess most people do. Some of the physical declines that we see that, again, kind of speed up during this middle adulthood phase. So first, there are often visual declines. And I would say everything I'm about to describe, these are primary aging. So these are things you can expect really no matter what your level of like diet and exercise and overall health is. Pretty much everyone inevitably are going to see some of these declines. So the most common things that happens in vision is something called presbyopia, which I'll write on the board, because I know you want to know how that's spelled. So presbyopia, we'll see this presby prefix in a couple other places. So if it helps you to remember words like that, presby is, I want to say Greek for old. Might be Latin, something. Greek or Latin for old. So we'll see that a couple times pop up here. So presbyopia refers to basically like old vision or old eyes. And specifically what happens is you get up into like your 40s and 50s. There's a part of the eye called the lens that's normally very flexible. It kind of sits behind your pupil. And the job of the lens is to adjust itself so that you can focus at different distances. So if I'm looking at like my finger up close to my face versus looking at something out the window, my lens is changing shape to try to accommodate those different focus distances. So as you get older, the lens, like a lot of other parts of the body, gets really rigid and it can't adjust itself as easily as it used to be able to. So presbyopia is basically where you can no longer focus at those different distances. So most older people will lose their ability specifically to focus on things that are close to them. So they might be able to focus on things far away, but they have a hard time like reading. That's why it's very common for people who are elderly to have like reading glasses that will help kind of adjust some of that presbyopia. In addition to that, some other vision things that happen, the pupil starts to shrink and the muscles that kind of open the pupil also become weaker. So when the pupil is smaller, you take in less light, which makes it harder to see in like dark conditions. The lens also starts to yellow in addition to becoming rigid. So older people, have kind of this cloudy yellowing of their vision. There's also, there's like fluids and things in the eye that start to, you have issues with those. Like there can be contaminants in there, things like that. So all of that leads to poor vision in dim light, difficulty detecting colors properly. So that can lead to all kinds of issues, like with driving, for example, especially driving at night. Older people tend to be, very prone to accidents and things because of that. So in addition to those visual declines, there's also declines in hearing. And another presby word you should know is called presbycusis. So again, presby means old. I'm assuming cusis means something to do with hearing, because that would make sense. So presbycusis is this decline in our ability to hear sounds, particularly sounds that are of like higher frequencies. So have we talked in this class about how hearing works? I don't think we have. I talk about it in like intro psych. The cochlea? Yeah, that would have been in general psych though, which you took with me. So yeah, so for those of you who didn't take general psych and maybe you learned in like a biology course, do you know a little bit about how you hear things?
Yes, but everyone in here didn't take a general psych class?
I know, yeah.
I thought that was a
Well, everyone would have taken a general psych, but not necessarily with me. So I know when I teach it, I go into detail about how hearing works, but not necessarily every instructor would do that.
I thought it was a prerequisite for...
Yes, it is.
So.
Yeah. So everyone should have taken that class, but they might not have learned that specific detail or information is what I'm saying, yeah. So it's just kind of the gist of it. You have this thing called the cochlea. It looks like a little snail shell in the inner ear, and it's filled with all this fluid that shifts around whenever a sound comes in, vibrates, shifts this fluid around. You have these little hair cells that stick up kind of all over the inside lining of that cochlea. And whenever the fluid moves, it moves those hair cells, and then those hair cells actually fire action potentials to your brain. That's kind of how you hear, gist of it, okay? And essentially what happens, those little hair cells, they're pretty fragile and delicate. So if there's too much movement, like if you have a really loud noise that comes into the ear, those hair cells can break. And if they break, they're not going to send signals to the brain anymore. And the ones that detect really high-pitched noises, they're really thin. Like if you've ever played guitar, you might know, the thinner string gives you a higher note, the thicker strings gives you a lower note. And that's the same for the resonance of the string as well. So the thin hairs vibrate at higher frequencies, so they hear higher frequencies, they break more easily as well, and then they cannot repair themselves once they're broken. So over the course of our lifetime, as we're subjected to loud, high-frequency noises at any point, we're constantly losing those hair cells. And eventually you get to your 40s or 50s, you've lost enough that you lose a pretty large range of the sounds that you can detect. So that's presbycusis. You have this kind of decline in sensitivity to high-pitched noises. People in, yeah, go ahead.
Kids can hear higher pitched noises than
Yes, that's exactly why. So a freshly newborn baby is going to have all those hair cells perfectly intact, assuming they don't have any, congenital disease or something. And then you sort of slowly lose them throughout your lifespan. So yeah, the older you get, the less high-pitched sounds you can hear. This happens to me actually all the time in like real life. My 15-year-old son will hear like loud, high-pitched sounds that I am not aware of. So yeah, because he still has most of his hair cells, although he's probably losing a lot because he has headphones in constantly. So if you want to avoid this, if this is something you want to try to delay at least, you should not listen to headphones at full volume as much as possible. If you're going to go somewhere like a concert or something where there's loud noises, it's a good idea to there's like specific earplugs that'll allow you to kind of dampen the sound but still enjoy the music fully. So anytime you're around really loud sounds, you should be protecting your ears. Most people don't, so you end up with yeah.
Is it better for you to have like the headphones that just cover your ears rather than the ones that go inside your ears?
No, not necessarily. It really just depends on the volume. You could have those ones that cover your ears and turn it up really loud. It's going to do just as much damage as the ones that go in your ears. Yeah.
This is really creepy because, like, just before this, I was looking up concert earplug stuff because I'm going to go to Taylor Swift's concert.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, you're ahead of me. Then you knew what we were going to talk about and what you should do already. So.
Somehow.
Is that the one that's in Seattle?
Yeah.
Okay, what else? Some other things that happen, oftentimes people in their 40s and 50s, they also have a hard time like separating out sounds. So if you have a really noisy environment where maybe someone's trying to talk to them, but there's traffic in the background or there's a baby crying or whatever, their brain isn't as good at like piecing out which part of the sound is this person talking to me, which part is the sirens, which part is the baby crying. And so they have a really hard time hearing specific things if they're in like noisy environments. So that can make it difficult to like carry on a conversation, for example. Men tend to show these hearing declines more like earlier and more severely than women do, but that's probably due to like environmental things. I mean, historically, men have typically done jobs that have like very noisy things like heavy machinery. You think about like construction or woodworking or things that tend to be more masculine jobs. You're working with tools that are really loud. So that might be a cause of it. It could also be something, biological and genetic that are contributing to that as well.
And we're more stubborn and definitely don't want to wear hearing protection.
No comment. Okay, so you got vision issues, hearing issues. In addition to that, you have declines in the skin as well. So this one is probably one of the most obvious. You can see it in people as they're aging. So you tend to develop wrinkles. Maybe the interesting thing is that it tends to happen in a very predictable pattern. It's not like wrinkles just show up all over the body at the same time. It kind of happens in this progressive way. So typically, wrinkles will start in the forehead. I'm in my 30s. I'm already starting to get some of these like wrinkles up here. You also get crow's feet, which are like around the eyes. You start to get wrinkles there. You also tend to have skin is less elastic. So, in your youth, you can stretch around and move around and your skin will snap back to where it's supposed to be. You can gain weight and lose weight and it'll kind of recover. As you get older, it loses that elasticity, and so your skin can start to kind of like sag in places, especially places where you might have changes often. So like in the stomach area, in the arms and the legs are where you often see the most kind of like sagging of skin. And again, most of that is due to losing that elasticity. People in this middle age can also have issues with like dry skin. The skin starts to thin as well, which makes it easier for like bruises and cuts and things to occur. The skin, as probably not surprising, these skin declines are much faster if you have lots of exposure to sunlight, especially if you're not using, protection like sunscreen. So best way to delay the effects on skin is to avoid sunlight and to use sunscreen anytime you are out in the sun. We also start to see declines in musculature. So it's a lot harder for the body to maintain or build new muscle as we get older. So that causes all kinds of issues. Obviously, it's going to make elderly people weaker, so they're going to have a harder time lifting things, walking upstairs, doing any kind of strenuous activity. But it can also contribute to things like falls because the muscles aren't able to support their posture as well as they were before. Muscle mass tends to decline in women more quickly than it does in men. And there's also kind of some changes. So you're losing musculature. In addition to that, you're often replacing that musculature with fat. So you might not necessarily lose weight. It's more like the muscle is shifting to fat instead. Men tend to collect that fat kind of like on their upper abdomen and their back, whereas women tend to accumulate it more like on the waist and the upper arms. So you start to see some of those like gender differences in fat deposits. Probably not surprisingly, that can be offset by diet and exercise. So the more like resistance training you do through your young adulthood and early middle adulthood, the less likely you are to have these musculature declines. So you should be lifting weights on a somewhat regular basis if you're not already. I think that's all I was going to say about muscle stuff. We also see quite a bit of decline in the skeleton as well. So the bone density starts to go down. We talked a little bit about bone density in the context of like puberty blockers. And the reason for that decline in bone density might be similar. So as we get older, we also start to produce less of the sex hormones. So men will produce less testosterone, women will produce less estrogen. And we know there's this, high correlation between those hormones and bone density. So that might be one of the things that's contributing to that decreased bone density. So that makes it, again, more likely that bones will break. So you're more likely to fall because you're losing musculature. And then if you do fall, you're more likely to break a bone because your bones are becoming basically weaker and thinner and less dense. You can also have things like, those discs of your spine can sort of collapse, or you can have issues there. So that can lead to all kinds of back problems and posture issues. Again, having lots of resistance exercise can help the bones as well. Having healthy diet. We're going to talk on, I think, the next slide about menopause, which contributes heavily to this, loss of bone density. One of the treatments for menopause that helps a lot with that is like hormone therapy. So taking estrogen to replace the estrogen that's being lost. Women do have a lot more skeletal decline than men do. So they're much more likely to have things like osteoporosis, which is where you have like really severe loss of bone density. So in addition to all of those declines, we also have declines in our reproductive system, which I have more slides on this one specifically, so we'll kind of move ahead. So for women, the main decline in fertility is referred to as menopause. So menopause, onset of that can happen anytime between like late 30s and 50s. So there's a really wide variable range of when menopause is going to occur. And essentially what happens as you get older, like I was saying, your body stops producing, or it produces a lot less of those sex hormones. So for women, they have this drastic drop in the amount of estrogen that's being produced. And so that leads to all kinds of issues. So it triggers, bone density issues. It also stops like the menstrual cycle. So women will stop having periods in this time. This may be a bonus. All the rest of the things about menopause suck, but at least you don't have to deal with periods anymore. So you have things like heat flashes, libido goes down, you have, sexual difficulties. There's other changes happening kind of in the vaginal area. You have dryness, irritation, things like that due to the lack of estrogen. It can also lead to things like mood swings and sleep difficulties. Some of those sleep difficulties are due to the heat flashes. So women might, while they're trying to sleep, they'll have like night sweats. But it also just causes overall insomnia. And it also increases rates of depression as well. So like I said, symptoms can be reduced by hormone treatment. So basically just replacing the estrogen that the body is no longer producing at the same rate. So the benefits of that hormone therapy are that they help with a lot of the issues I was just talking about. It reduces things like heat flashes. It helps protect against some of that bone density loss. There's different types of hormone therapy. The most common is just replacing estrogen, but then there's others that add like other kind of cocktails of hormones that you be taking. What else? Oh, there are some side effects too that you should be aware of. So taking the hormone therapy does increase risk of things like heart attack and blood clots. So taking hormones like this, so even if you take, like, for example, taking birth control, like the birth control pill is basically just hormones. It's estrogen, sometimes progesterone mixed in there. And it's been shown that taking birth control and then also taking hormones in menopause, it can help reduce some rates of cancer. So I'm trying to remember, I think it reduces the rates of like uterine cancer, but it increases the rates of cervical cancer. So you're kind of like trading off risks there. Same thing in menopause, it can, if you're taking hormone therapy, it can increase risk of certain cancers as well. So women, they go through this menopause. We have a name for it. For men, there is a decrease in fertility, but it's not quite as like this, drastic change that women have. There's not. So for women, there's kind of like a point where they realize they're going through menopause because they stop having their period. So it's kind of obvious that it's happening. Whereas with men, they don't really have like that super obvious marker to say that they've started this process of decreased, reproductivity. I think we already kind of talked about this, but some of the things that happen is you have less sperm that's being produced, and the sperm that is being produced tends to be less functional, so it's not able to like swim as effectively, it's less mobile. Okay, so those are some of the main kind of physical primary aging declines, at least, things that you can expect, again, for pretty much anybody. There's things we can do to delay it a little bit, but it's inevitable that we pretty much all will go through some of these declines as we get older. Then in addition to that, during middle adulthood, you have increased risk for certain illnesses and disabilities. So rates of things like cancer start to go up as you get into middle adulthood. About a third of U.S. deaths that happen in middle age are due to cancer. So it's a very large contributor to our death rates, although that statistic probably comes from before COVID, so you throw in COVID and that probably throws those numbers off a little bit. In general, cancer results from mutations in a cell, and it essentially causes the cell to reproduce, out of control. So normally, like you have skin cells or whatever, they die and they reproduce so that they can be replaced. But a cancerous cell, that reproductive trigger just kind of goes haywire and it reproduces to the point that you develop like tumors and other things like that. So in general, the best way to prevent cancer is to reduce the environmental exposures that trigger those mutations. So pretty much anything that's like, bad for you in some context might potentially cause some of these mutations. So, for example, like with skin cancer, that's because you have exposure to usually like the UV light in the sun is disrupting the DNA in your skin cells. That causes it to mutate and then become cancerous. Obviously things like smoking cigarettes, same thing. All those toxins in your lungs are interacting with the cells in there, making them more likely that they'll have those mutations and eventually become cancerous. So best way to avoid developing cancer is to try to avoid all those kind of environmental toxins that we know trigger that process. Yeah.
I was wondering how many years of like sun exposure does it take to like develop skin cancer, and how intense does it have to be?
Yeah.
I just wondered.
Yeah, I don't know like how to put a number on it. There probably is someone somewhere who's like quantified how much sun exposure you need, or like what raises your chances, whatever percentage. But I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. I know just in general, the more you're exposed to sunlight without sunscreen, the more likely it is you'll get cancer. So but I don't know numbers off the top of my head. That's a good question. In addition to all those environmental things, we do know there's also some genetic predispositions. So some people are just more likely to develop cancer for various reasons. There are certain cancers that seem to be, almost entirely genetic. And so there's not really anything you can do to prevent that, but sometimes just getting tested, at this point they can test your DNA and find some of those markers for if you're likely to be predisposed. And then you at least know, okay, if I'm predisposed to get skin cancer, then I should really be careful of sunlight or whatever it is. So you can kind of adjust your lifestyle to accommodate that. In addition, knowing some of the warning signs of cancer. So cancer is one of those things, if you catch it early, you're much more likely to have a successful recovery compared to if you put it off and you catch it later in its progression. So some of the warning signs you should maybe pay attention to, not to, I know you're all going to get on like WebMD and have like a freak out after reading these because you've probably had all these symptoms at some point in time. But if you have frequent, chronic, where it's really noticeable, change in bowel or bladder habits, A sore that doesn't heal, so if you cut yourself or something like that and it just will not heal. Unusual bleeding or discharge from pretty much anywhere. Thickening lumps in your breasts or testicles, those are often a sign of cancer. Any difficulties with like swallowing things that you haven't experienced before. Changes in like moles on your skin, or like nagging cough or hoarseness that won't go away, that's not caused by something obvious, like flu or bronchitis or whatever. All those might be indication of cancer. So if you have those things, you should go to a doctor and at least get it checked out. It's also a good idea to get the sort of recommended regular checkups and screenings. Probably not something that any of you are doing at this point in time. Well, maybe. You might be getting like pap smears. I can't remember what age they start recommending that. I think pretty early on. Yeah. So pap smears, mostly looking for like HPV, cervical cancer, things like that. Mammograms, I think, start around 40. So mammograms are where they're scanning your breast to look for cancerous tissue. And they recommend doing most of those scans like, every year or every 2 years, depending. Men should get an annual prostate screening starting at about age 50. And then men and women should have periodic screening for like colon cancer, so having a colonoscopy. So all of that, the goal of it is to try to catch the disease early so that you are more likely to have a successful recovery from it. For women, another one is getting the HPV vaccine. That will prevent, a lot of cases of cervical cancer. It's, I think, the only cancer we have right now that has a vaccine for it. Okay. So cancer is a big one. Another disease that becomes more prevalent during middle adulthood is cardiovascular diseases, so issues with the heart and the cardiovascular system. That's responsible for about 25% of middle-aged deaths. Again, not taking into account COVID because these numbers come from before that. So things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart attacks, those are kind of the main things that lead to death in cardiovascular disease. I think, I teach too many different classes. Did I have a slide up like last time where it showed the different different symptoms of heart attacks in men and women? Or was that my other class?
I don't think so.
Okay, this is probably my other class. So, I always heard growing up that the best indication that you might be having a heart attack is pain in your chest, but it turns out that's mostly true only for men. So men, if they're having a heart attack, they might have pain kind of in like their chest area and like a tightness. Women tend to have more pain in like their neck and their back if they're having a heart attack. So that's one kind of, major symptom to look for. It also seems to often affect like the left side of the body before it affects the right side of the body. So especially if you have like the left side of your chest or back, you're having pain that's abnormal, then you might want to get to a doctor very quickly to have that looked at. Some things that contribute to heart attack risk: smoking. So smoking will increase your chances of cancer, will also increase chances of cardiovascular risk. Having like unhealthy cholesterol levels, which often comes from a diet that's really high in salts or sodium, can also lead to higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Things like being overweight and sedentary. So, as usual, best way to prevent these: exercise, eat healthy, get good sleep. Osteoporosis is like the extreme version of bone density loss. So we expect some bone density loss in everybody as they get older, but where it becomes an illness, we call that osteoporosis. So that's where you have much more severe bone loss. If you look at a picture of someone's bones who has osteoporosis, it looks almost like Swiss cheese or like a sponge that has big holes in it or something. So they have really pronounced, lowered density of bone. Again, main things that can help with that are exercise, especially like weight-bearing exercise, resistance training. Also getting good amounts of vitamin D and calcium in your diet will help reduce risk of osteoporosis. And then the other thing that middle-aged people are also prone to are injuries, which I already kind of talked about. You're more likely to fall because you're losing muscle mass. If you try to lift something heavy that you were able to easily lift in your 30s, all of a sudden if you've lost that muscle mass, you might not be able to. You could break or sprain a joint or an arm or something like that. And then because the bones are less dense, it's much more easy to break a bone or fracture a bone. Any questions about physical changes in middle adulthood? Okay, let's shift to kind of cognitive change. I guess this is still technically physical because it's stuff going on in the physical brain, but this also contributes then to some of the cognitive changes we'll see in a little bit. So last time I told you, you finally got your prefrontal cortex fully myelinated, but you only get to enjoy that for a short amount of time because then as you get into middle adulthood, you start to lose some of that myelination. So you should enjoy your fully developed brain while you have it. Try to absorb as much experiences and information as you can, because soon it will start to wither away and decline, very sadly. In addition to, so I guess I kind of mixed up some physical and cognitive things here. Let's skip to the last one and then we'll go to the second one. So you also have some shifts in the way that your brain sort of activates during different tasks as you get older. So normally in a young, healthy brain, your brain is very like compartmentalized to where there's certain parts that are really specialized to do specific functions. So like if I'm, trying to recognize someone's face, there's one little area of my brain that's super active trying to make those calculations happen. If I'm riding a bicycle, there's other areas of my brain doing it that are very different from those face recognition areas. As you get older, you lose some of that specialization. And it's like your brain, because you're losing some of that myelin, some of your neurons are dying off. So each little area is becoming a little bit weaker. So your brain sort of compensates by just using more areas to try to do the same task. So someone who's older, if they're trying to recognize a face, instead of just that one little area being active, you'll get activity there, but also in all the areas surrounding it as well. And then reduced practice refers to the fact that oftentimes we don't like to do things that are challenging and difficult. So as we get older and certain tasks become more challenging, we're likely to avoid those tasks. But then that gets into this kind of cyclical loop where if you're avoiding doing the task and practicing it, then your brain's not getting kind of the exercise that it needs to be good at that task. So then it gets even worse at it, and it's even more challenging, so we avoid it more, and then we have less practice, and then it just kind of repeats and repeats. So I guess kind of take away from that, it's a good idea as you get older to continue pushing yourself, challenging yourself intellectually and cognitively so that you can keep your brain nice and healthy. So some of the declines that happen. So first, before I say anything about the declines, I want to point out that a lot of this depends on how you measure the decline, which is a really important kind of factor to consider. So what we find, if you guys remember way back when we talked about research methods, like first week of class, I told you about longitudinal versus cross-sectional studies. Remember, longitudinal is where you have the same group of people, you track them over the course of a long time. So if I want to know, okay, how bad does your memory get as you get older, and I'm going to do a longitudinal study on that, I might take all of you who are right now in like your late teens and 20s, give you a memory test, and then bring you back 10 years from now and test you again, and then in another 10 years test you again, right, and see if your memory declines. That'd be longitudinal. Cross-sectional is where you have multiple groups that are already at different ages right now, and you test them on all the same things. So I might give all of you a memory test. I might find a group of 30-year-olds right now, give them a memory test, find a group of 40-year-olds right now, give them a memory test, and then compare those, right? So what we see when we do cross-sectional designs is a very drastic decline in cognitive ability, okay? So I'm just going to draw like roughly on the board. I'm not even going to put numbers. I'll just draw kind of what that would look like. So if you do cross-sectional, we're measuring something like memory, goes downhill pretty quickly. But if we do that as a longitudinal, so this one's cross-sectional, let's see X for that. If we do a longitudinal study instead, so I took all of you right now, measured your memory, measured again in 10 years and 20 years, then it's not nearly as bad as this. Like you still have some decline, but it's like much more gradual and kind of takes longer to happen. So we tend to have a lot more data from cross-sectional designs because if you remember that one's easier to do, easier and cheaper. I could get it all done like today if I wanted to instead of waiting 20 years. So we have more data from that. So that tends to kind of push people to believe that you have these really rapid declines as you get older. But I think what we're more interested in probably is longitudinal, right? Because you want to know, how bad is your memory going to be 20 years from now, right? Part of the reason we see this cross-sectional difference is due to like cohort effects. So each generation tends to be more educated than the generations from the past. So when I'm comparing, if I compare to you to 40-year-olds right now, your age is not the only thing that's different. Another thing that's different is that probably all of those 40-year-olds are not as educated as you are. So they're not using their brain as much necessarily. The jobs that they do might be more like, labor-based or whatever. So that might be why you see some of these declines. It's more due to cohort effects rather than aging itself. So just keep that in mind. I guess basically kind of main thing to take away from that is that a lot of the declines that you think you might go through as you get older are probably not as bad as you often hear from like media, news sources, things like that. Okay, so continuing on, what are some of the changes we see despite everything I just said? So first of all, another thing to know is the difference between what's called crystallized and fluid intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is basically like your knowledge of things that have already happened. It would include things like, like trivia or knowing history. Even knowing all the stuff that I'm teaching you right now will eventually become crystallized intelligence. It's like your little reservoir of knowledge that you can access. Fluid intelligence is more like working on a problem in the moment. So like if right now my computer crashed and I have to sit up here and troubleshoot and try to figure out like, okay, how do I get this to go again? That would be more like fluid intelligence, of trying to work in the moment to solve a problem or accomplish a task. What we see is that as we get older, we have increases in crystallized intelligence, but fluid intelligence is what starts to decline. So we're kind of building up this reservoir of knowledge throughout our life, but we also get worse at kind of working in the moment, especially if it's a task we've never done before, if it's brand new, we don't have any practice. A lot of that decrease in fluid intelligence seems to be basically like processing speed. Like since the brain's losing myelin, it just gets slower. And so it's like an old computer trying to run a new program. It's just like slow and isn't going to work very well. So we see decreases in fluid intelligence, but increases in crystallized intelligence. Overall, we see some decreases in executive function. So again, I often think of, aging is almost like reverting to childhood. It's like we talked about in childhood, you're building up all these executive skills, your ability to regulate your emotions, your ability to plan and organize and think ahead and, set goals and accomplish them. In your childhood, you're building all that up. You get to like young adulthood and, you sort of peak and then you start to kind of decline again and revert back to some of those childhood tendencies. So older adults, they particularly will have trouble inhibiting impulses. So that can come out in a couple ways, particularly in like conversation. If you ever have a conversation with someone in their 50s, you might find it might be similar to talking to someone with like ADHD, for example. So the conversation might kind of jump around from topic to topic. They might have a hard time staying on one topic. If you're talking to them and you're in the middle of a sentence, they might cut in with their story or whatever they're going to share, because they have a hard time inhibiting that impulse to say what's come to their mind, basically. So reduced inhibition, they have declines in working memory, which is really similar to what I was talking about with fluid intelligence, like working on something in the moment. I'm just trying to see if I have it in my notes. I don't think I do, and it doesn't necessarily fit any of these bullet points, but they also have difficulty with what's called like associative memory. I'm trying to remember again if I have. No, okay, yeah. So associative memory is basically where you are trying to remember two things that are paired together often. So like, for example, matching someone's name to their face. That would be an associative memory. So people, as they get older, they might remember one. They might remember just the name, or they might remember the person's face, but they have a hard time like binding those together into like one, thing that's paired. Okay, so far we've got decreases in crystallized intelligence and executive function, but increases in sorry, I said that backwards. Decreases in fluid intelligence and executive function, increases in crystallized intelligence, and they have increases in problem solving and expertise. So kind of similar, we talked about expertise in young adulthood, that continues. By this point, most people historically in their middle age will have been working at the same career for 10, 20, 30 years. So their expertise in whatever it is they've been doing that whole time is obviously going to be increased. And they tend to be good at solving like long-term problems. So not great at doing things like in the moment, I need to fix this right now. But when it comes to more long-term problems, they tend to have better skills at that. And that's mostly probably just due to life experience, that they've had more experience solving those problems, so they're getting better at it as they get older. Okay. Some of the things that can help prevent that cognitive decline are basically just staying cognitively engaged as much as possible. There's a lot of ways to do that, which I've talked about quite a few times, hobbies, learning a new language, learning new skills, etc. In addition, it's becoming more common for people in midlife to go back to school and, to go to college, either to finish a degree that they didn't finish before or to start a new one. So about 17% of college students are over the age of 35, so getting into that, middle adulthood age. And again, those numbers are probably pre-COVID. I would imagine that with all the schools that transition to having more online access, that number has probably gone up quite a bit because it's easier for someone who has a job and kids, etc., to go and get a degree if they can do it online and not have to worry about, being at a class at a specific time. Most of the time, yeah.
COVID also made careers really needed, like nursing and
Yes.
teachers and stuff. So it they provided incentive for people to go back to get degrees for that. I know I have a friend who got paid to go back to school to get her teaching degree.
Yeah.
Because they needed teachers.
Yeah, that's a great point too. Yeah, there's all these incentives, and then in addition, there were probably people who lost their job, because of stuff that was going on in COVID. They needed to find a new career path, and the best way to do that often is to go back and get a new degree. So yes. So things like career changes and life transitions, kind of like we were just saying, are often what sparks this, that someone decides they're going to go back to college. There are lots of industries and jobs that, like you're saying, will pay someone either to get a full degree or even just to take a few classes, get a certificate to try to improve their skills. It's becoming much more common. There's also kind of a shift. I don't know if you guys are aware of this. This is kind of like behind the scenes academic stuff that gets talked about amongst faculty, but probably you guys don't know about. There's kind of a decline, pretty drastic decline, proportionately in the population of 18-year-olds that are graduating from high school. So part of that, if you think of, let's just follow the line of things we've talked about. We said more people are putting off having kids, and there's more people who don't have kids at all, right? So that means then you're going to have less kids going through the K-12 system and eventually graduating high school and then going to college, right? So then you have less of a population to pull from for me to get paid my salary, basically, right? If there's less 18-year-olds graduating, less people coming to college, that's less tuition money, less money that goes to professors and administrators, etc. So, yeah.
Is it really less people graduating though, or is it more people getting GEDs?
It's less, I'm saying, proportionately in the population, right? Historically, whatever percentage of the people who are alive right now would be 18-year-olds and graduating. That proportion is getting lower. More of our population now is older, is another way to say that. So there's a lot of institutions that are also looking for how can we make up some of that lost revenue. And one way of doing that is that they target people in midlife. Okay, if we don't have a bunch of 18-year-olds graduating high school who are going to take college classes, then let's go try to recruit people in their 30s or their 40s who maybe want to make a career change and try to kind of build our classes to accommodate them more. So even universities are kind of driving some of this change because we're recruiting people and trying to design our programs and classes to be more accessible to people in that age. Some people do it just for basically personal achievement. So even if they've got a career that they're enjoying and they don't necessarily need a degree, they might go back and even, just take a few classes or get a degree or whatever just to have that sense of accomplishment, to feel like they're learning something new. Probably not surprising, students in midlife face unique challenges. Often they are people who have been out of school for maybe decades, and they might not remember what it's like to have to study for exams or to come to class at a certain time or how to interact with their professors or their peers. So a lot of those like just social, cultural expectations can be very challenging. Also, they often are more likely to be balancing things like a job and a spouse and kids and trying to fit, their schoolwork into that. So that can be very challenging as well. They also may feel ostracized in their classes. If they come in and they're the only 50-year-old in a group of 19 and 20-year-olds, then they may have a hard time connecting with others. So then they have less opportunities for like study groups and things like that. So again, those are things that a lot of universities and colleges are looking at to try to accommodate, make college more accessible and comfortable for people in these age groups. Okay, any questions about physical and cognitive development in middle adulthood?